So without much further ado, I would just like to warmly welcome Professor Quack and give the floor over to you. I cannot see you, but I know you are here.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, okay, now I can see you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction. And now I will start sharing my screen, and I hope that it works well. It seems to work.
Yes,
okay.
It works perfectly.
Fine. So a good afternoon or whatever time it is in your zone, and welcome here from my part. And I will present, as already announced, about Demotic Egyptian traditions of the war of the gods against the giants. And this is research going back to some degree, at least for quite a long time, and it's mainly work on papyrus collections, of which the most important places for what I will present today are Copenhagen and Florence, and to a lesser degree, New Haven. This work essentially goes back to quite a long time. It has, so to say, deep roots. One moment, sorry, I have to... sorry. Yep, okay, now it works. So this is sort of a historical image. I hope you will recognize me still, although at that time I was really a lot younger. And so this started about 1995, 1996, when I was able to spend about a year in Copenhagen, financed by the DFG, and the research got a lot of more stimulus after I was awarded the Leibniz Award in 2011 by the DFG, and that helped me a lot to finance research, travel to collections. And now this image here is quite realistic in the size of the fragments I'm working with ordinarily. So be prepared for what will be a very lecuminous lecture to some degree. And I'm sorry to say this image was taken when I was not really working on the war of the gods against the giants. So what you are seeing here is instead part of the song for a festival of drunkenness in favor of Bastet, which, given its obvious relation to Herodotus 260, would also be an interesting topic for this lecture series, but not today. So let's go on. For those who want to read more, most of what I will present today went into a very long contribution to a big volume on demotic literary text brought out by Kim Rüholt and me, a nice volume with 49 different papyri published. And actually, you will see that the number 49 has some implications. I will come to this immediately, but now, as I told you, this is work based on very fragmentary material, and that has some difficulties.
All findings.
Sorry, somebody has to mute himself.
Also, in case you're interested in how we whole model and insights, was able to explain 9% of the variance and change relationship.
Okay, I hope that now I can go on. So I know this will be a bit difficult to present because all the material is so fragmentary. So I will start by sketching in broad lines what I hope to be able to have proved or at least make plausible. So short version of my results. I claim that in Egypt, presumably in early Hellenistic times, under the historic impression of the campaign of Alexander the Great, and in interaction with Greek mythology, an extraordinarily extensive mythological narrative was elaborated. And the main theme of this is the war campaigns of the gods on Earth. Geographically, most of the fighting takes place in Asia, all the way to India, and the Egyptian army is led mainly by Osiris and Isis, with other gods joining in. and the main opponents are the giants. Presumably, this mythological narrative appears in Greek reception in Diodorus, and it can also be found in Plutarch in a more excerpted form. And now the next step for me will be to set out what sources I have at the moment to base my claims upon. And as I told you, these are mainly fragmentary texts, and most but not all of them appeared about 2 years ago in the volume of which I showed you just the title page. Yes, and now it comes to this number 49, because this volume was growing about several years. Again, somebody has to mute herself. This volume was growing for some time over the years, and at one point Kim Ryholt and I decided that we would put it in a final state with 49 papyri in it, because that would be 7 times 7, so a nice number. And now the point is, I realized only after this decision that another papyrus would also be relevant for the others which I presented, and this means that there is still more which has to come, and there has to come more anyway. And well, I start with a papyrus which was published not by me, but by Richard Jesno, which is now in Berkeley among the Teptunis collection. It's a manuscript from cartonnage, and it dates to about the 3rd century BCE, probably the earlier part of it. So the date is of quite some importance, even if the text otherwise is relatively difficult to read and still will need a lot more study. Actually, as chance had it, the publication by Richard Jesno came out shortly after I had published my view on the other Demotic literary texts, which means that Richard Jesno was not able to take into account my results, which might have led to different interpretations of some points. For the moment, I will only say that here, in general terms, Apopis, the traditional enemy of the Egyptian gods, appears as one of the more essential figures of the narrative. There is also a title, The Great One of the East, which Richard Jesno wanted to link with another Egyptian deity, namely Sopdu, while I, based on my knowledge from the other papyri, think that it's rather likely to be just a designation of Apopis. And then the sun god and Osiris also appear in it, so it's quite interesting, but I think it needs the other manuscripts to be put more into perspective. The next manuscript I present here, at the moment I'm working in descending chronological order, has the advantage that it has been published already a number of years ago by Edda Bresciani. At that time it was in the Michaelidis collection. It has now been moved to the British Museum. You can improve the readings in some places, and please note that here this top fragment was placed and still is placed too much to the right. In the actual papyrus is conserved now, so what you see here is a digital reconstruction which Claudia Madana did for me in Photoshop. And the interesting point of this manuscript is that Osiris appears here as a living figure in the context of a war campaign, and furthermore Anubis appears, who is explicitly said to be a son of Osiris. Those who are able to read Demotic can see it very nicely down here. And then now for an unpublished manuscript on which I am working. This is from the Marburg collection, coming also from cartonnage and from the paleography, as well as judging from documentary texts from the same fine complex. It's likely to date to the later 3rd century BCE with an origin in northern Middle Egypt. And here we have again the gods as protagonists, especially Shu and Geb, but also Re and probably Nate. and we have a very clear topic of war. And now I come to Teptunis as a very important find spot for demotic literary papyri from the Roman period, from temple context, and where the first one to mention is Papyrus Carlsberg 79 with additional fragments in Florence. This is, as you can see, a very idiosyncratic manuscript with an extremely ornate, somewhat Baroque style, which clearly stands out from practically all other literary papyri from Teptunis. And it has some similarity in the general type of handwriting in Papyrus Teptunis 227, which is a Greek documentary text from Theogonis, a village rather near to Teptunis. So I think this might be a special type of script used there. Anyway, Papyrus Carlsberg 79 is one of the manuscripts at Copenhagen which have been put under glass for already a long time. So I looked at it already back in 1995. I even identified some additional fragments. However, at that time, I could still see a very exciting context, but the decidedly unfamiliar script kept me from more intensive study. You could say that I actually ran away from it for more than 10 years. And the reason why I finally reversed my direction of travel is another papyrus at Copenhagen, Papyrus Carlsberg 621. And this is rather clearly a Teptunis hand belonging probably to the earlier 2nd century CE. It aroused my interest first because of the great role of Isis in it, because at that time I was carrying out research in the framework of the Cluster of Excellence Asia and Europe in a special project called Oriental Religions. In memory of this project, I'm still using the presentation template from that time, although it's, so to say, a little bit outdated. Anyway, it soon became apparent that one important character of Papyrus Carlsberg 621 was a certain Arian, and this Arian also appears in Papyrus Carlsberg 79, so I had no choice but to work on both manuscripts. Now for this Papyrus Carlsberg 621, there's one small detail which might be important, although you might be baffled what might be really important on this fragment. Well, the important thing is, of course, you have here something which is very clearly ink and quite a lot removed from the rest of the writing. And where the sign you can see here could in Demotic Egyptian writing either be a one consonantal sign P or the number 60. And if you see this single sign so far away from all the rest, it can hardly be anything else than the number. And this means that we have a page number here and a manuscript with 60 pages. That is quite a bit. So then another manuscript at Copenhagen from Teptunis is Papyrus Carlsberg 643. And well, this is a manuscript for which I have largely completed the philological work, but it was this one manuscript which could no longer go into the volume when we decided to finish it with 49 papyri. And at the moment it's planned that this papyrus, together with Papyrus Marburg 39 and two other manuscripts on which Holger Kockelmann, now professor of Egyptology at Leipzig University, is working, that this will, together with some more, make up for one more volume of Demotic literary papyri. And just to give you also an impression of these other manuscripts, studied by Holger Kockelmann. Here we have Papyrus Carlsberg 460 with a very, very unusual hand, consistent in itself, but very unusual in orthography and character forms. So the greatest challenge is often to recognize a particular word as such in a safe place, and then you can apply it to all other instances. And there are more papyri from Teptunis, which Kim Ryholt will contribute to this joint publications. And anyway, we have in all of these mythological narratives in which Osiris Ben-Nefer appears as well as the great of the East Apopis, and these are very central for the complex I will discuss. In order to give you an impression of some more fragments relevant, this is here a papyrus now at Yale University, which mentions several Egyptian gods, Re and Thoth, probably busted, and then we have Apopis, who is said to go to a place called Pehi. So all these fragments, most of them rather small, this makes for difficult reading. It also makes for a difficult lecture. I hope you can bear with me. So let's try to resume what I have from this very many small fragments, where I will try to discover at least the broad lines. At the moment, I don't have any single instance where clearly two manuscripts are directly parallel to each other. So the postulate that this goes into one big narrative is based on the identity of several crucial characters. And let's now look for these. The first character to be mentioned is Osiris, who often has the epithet the king of the whole land, Osiris Ben-Nefer. And this means that we have Osiris as the living ruler of Egypt. And actually his Egyptian name Ben-Nefer, the one who is perfect in beauty, is clearly associated in the Egyptian texts with the kingship of Osiris. And in hieroglyphic and hieratic texts of the late period is regularly written in a cartouche like a royal name. And in connection with Osiris, one speaks also of an army or an army camp. And where then Osiris also receives the epithet bull as well as good male one of Geb. And particularly instructive with regard to Osiris' intentions of conquest is a passage in Papyrus Carlsberg 460, where it is said that a divine messenger is sent to Shu. Shu is actually the grandfather of Osiris, and then Shu greets him and then asks, quotation, "How is Osiris? How is the advance among them into Syria? Will he be able to conquer it and then return to you?" End quotation. And where the arming of the army with all parts of equipment is described in another passage. So we have Osiris as the active commander of the army, but still, well, you know, Osiris does die. And there's one passage in Papyrus Carlsberg 9 with some dramatic effect, and I will quote it in spite of its many lacunae. So it typically starts with a lacune, and then it goes on with one star displaced another on the way in the evening. Changed were the risings of Thothis. The moon made a lacune sky. Changed were their places of appearance. The villain among the giants rose up to strike the sky for them. Lacuna, him. They made the preparation, long lacuna, and then something like Set or perhaps Dry was the tutor. Re replied to him of great strength, the 4 stars, and then lacuna again, the one word lost. Among them, while Arian sat at the banquet at the gate of his bower of Bachtan with his nobles. Lacune, his, one word missing, of blood. It aroused amazement, groans, zeal, and great anger in the heart of Arian. He sent for the knowledgeable, longer lacune, of the Assyrians before him. He ordered them, look up to the sky and see the disk. Let nothing be hidden that happens. Lacune, the people. They read their scriptures, they looked to the sky, they saw the disk. They found the star of Osiris as it had left its path. Lacune, Arian asked them, what is it that has happened? It was a bad message that they told him. They told him the passing away of the enemy of Osiris has occurred. Well, in order to understand this sentence, you have to know a specific specific Egyptian trope where you say something evil has happened to the enemy of a positively connotated figure, when in reality the evil happens to just this figure. It's a very interesting sort of language taboo. Anyway, so the enemy of Osiris has died, and then evil happened to the bull, Lecune. Arian opened his mouth downward in a great abyss of cry. He took away the rest that were on his head. He threw them on the Lecune that were on him, the benches that were before him. He tore his robe of the garment, his uncertain word of purple wool. It came to pass that he girded himself with a garment of mourning. He led Lecune, and this is about the end of this fragment, and believe me, this is more or less the best preserved fragment I have. So I will come back to this figure of Arian later on. In further fragments, we see Osiris no longer as an active person, but as somebody who is lying on a bier, being lamented and probably being prepared for burial. And we hear also of Isis as the great widow of Osiris. And
her shadow kind of becomes a tree.
Sorry, please mute yourself again. So anyway, Osiris is being lamented at some length, and there is probably also a passage mentioning the body parts of Osiris, because we have something like those left to you, those by whom the land lives, those which are scattered over the lands in. And this could very well refer to the body parts of Osiris, because in Egyptian conception, they are divided over all of Egypt and at the same time considered a source of life. So we see all this horror at the death of Osiris and lamentation over him. And well, now from Osiris, let's pass over to Isis. Isis is especially prominent in the preserved parts of Papyrus Carlsberg's 621, where we have a mention of a feminine commander of the whole land commanding the army. And she is interacting with the Great One of the East. Again, a quotation: I will come up to Egypt, I will cause Lecune, the prince of Kabul, to come to Egypt. If it comes to pass that long Lecune of the great of the millions, Arian to Selous, his homeland, long Lecuna, it was filled into the magazine of the great of the East, the giant, long Lecuna, of getting to great of renown. From the way this is written, it seems to be the name of a place, probably a fortress. Anyway, it's called the Great Fortress of Egypt. Then again, long Lecune, gifts to cause him to arrive in the long Lecune. No one will trust, long Lecune. The giants said, long Lecuna, and we will take him to long Lecuna before the son of the lion, the son of the bull, Lecuna, Arian, the great one of millions. Thought the great god said, Isis, the great goddess, the Lecuna, the place where the true son of the bull is, and she will come to Egypt. Lecuna, Isis, the great goddess said, my father, lord of life, is long Lecuna to the east. However, may the incense altar be brought to me, long Lecuna, immediately. Behold its contents. Now this seems to be a quotation from a letter. The king's sister, the king's wife, the queen herself, is it the missing word, Isis, the great one, the mother of God, the great goddess, the mistress, Lecuna, where the giants are. The bar, soul of heaven, downthrower of the sea, Lecuna, to them. One brought me your offering and your delivery, Lecuna, the great god, the Lecuna of gods and men, and then it goes on even more Lecunas. I think I will spare you this part. So anyway, we see Isis is called king's sister, king's wife, queen herself, which is clearly a high social rank. This is quite interesting because she reigns as a queen beyond the rank of simply a king's wife, and this is reminiscent of a statement in Diodorus 1:17:3 that Osiris left the sovereignty of Egypt to her while he wandered through distant lands. And where there is another passage, very poorly preserved, there's a statement that it was some female figure who brought down Seth. I suppose that this female figure was Osiris, because here also a connection to Diodorus would be quite fitting. Diodorus states that Isis slew Typhon and his followers and became queen of Egypt. And somewhat in the same direction, we have Plutarch's statement in the Isidore 13 that while Osiris roamed the world, Typhon had not dared anything because Isis had carefully watched over him and had been unyielding. And then Isis appears in interaction with the giants, to which I will come back later. And yeah, I think that Isis is probably the one who speaks at least part of the laments for Osiris. And there are passages where I think that Isis reminds her interlocutors of the benefits of Osiris. This would fit well with Diodorus 1:21:6, according to whom Isis called upon the priests to bury Osiris like a god, referring to the benefits he had done. And then Isis' travel companion seems to be Thoth, who is explicitly referred to as her father. This is a genealogical connection which we have in Plutarch. We have it in Egyptian sources not so often, but by now relatively well documented in the Roman period. And this joint search of Isis and Thoth for Osiris is somewhat reminiscent of the Greek language text that survives in Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 3011. It involves an Egyptian king whose name is probably too restituted as Amenophthes. And there is mentioned a path on which the great god Hermes and the 1,000 named Isis went in search of the king of the gods, and this king of the gods is likely to be Osiris. Anyway, this path seems to lead to Memphis within 3 days. So much for this relatively small Greek Romance fragment. And Thoth, as the helper and companion of Isis, is also nicely paralleled in the magical papyrus PGM 24a. There we have a lot oracle that is used, which Isis and Hermes are said to have used when Isis was looking for her brother and husband Osiris. We have less specific indications in PGM 4 that Hermes supported the wandering Isis. And furthermore, Isis and Thoth are mentioned as companions of King Osiris in an as yet unpublished fragment of the historical review at the beginning of the narrative of the exploits of Inaros. If you want to know more about this, ask Kim Rühold. I owe to him this indication, and I'm sure he would be happy to tell you more about the Inaros epic. Then furthermore, in the Demotic Egyptian texts, we have Anubis and Horus alongside Thoth, and both are indicated as sons of Osiris, who would naturally be suitable candidates to help in the search for him. And as you know, of course, Anubis in particular is explicitly stated by Plutarch as a helper of Isis. And according to Diodorus 1:18:1, Osiris was accompanied on his campaign by Anubis and Macedon. Anubis appears also, as I have already shown you, in the Demotic Papyrus British Museum 10,848 in connection with the living Osiris. It seems that in the fragment we have there, he is introduced into the plot for the first time, because first somebody is spoken of who has the face of a jackal and then is explicitly indicated to be Anubis. And with Anubis as the son of Osiris, you know, of course, that Plutarch tells the version that Anubis was the product of an adulterous relationship between Osiris and Nephthys. By now, we have some more Egyptian language sources fitting very well in here. We have some other deities in the text like Nath, Sobek, Bastet, Montu, Geb, and Shu, unfortunately, mostly in relatively fragmentary passages. Shu especially appears in direct battle. Now we come to the opponents, and this brings up the question why I'm talking about giants all the time. And of course, the question behind this is, how do you say giant in Egyptian language? And well, I set out here from the Coptic, because the nice point of Coptic is that many of the preserved Coptic literary texts are translations from Greek, where often we still have the Greek text preserved, so we know quite certain which Greek word was translated. And in the translations of the Genesis book of the Old Testament, we have Coptic apoph, giant, as the translation of the Greek word gigas. And we also have the plural apophi. Now, in the Demotic Egyptian text I present to you, we have on the one hand Apopis, who is really traditionally the enemy of all Egyptian gods, most especially the sun god. However, what is more surprising for conventional Egyptologists is the fact that in these fragments, we also several times have the plural na-apepu, which fits well, of course, with this plural form, apophi, for the giants in the plural. And well, now, is Apopis a giant? I would say so. There are two different Egyptian texts known by now. One is the Esna cosmogony, which indicates that Apopis was 120 cubits long. A cubit is a bit more than half a meter, so this would be a bit more than 60 meters long. For a snake, that's quite something. It would dwarf any anaconda. And the other text is a papyrus in Berlin, which I published some years ago. There, Apopis even reaches 170 cubits, even bigger. And well, in order to make this a bit more interesting, in the Greek conception, the giants have snake legs, which would them certainly a suitable connection with the serpentine Apopis of the Egyptian traditions. Actually, I know that this plural na-apepu, the giants, also in an unpublished magical papyrus from the Ptolemaic period in Milan, and it is also attested in the already published Leiden manuscript of the myth of the sun's eye, where in the Egyptian text we have something like what happened to the goddess with the giants. The goddess is, of course, the positive hero of this tale. And for this passage, we have also the Greek translation. And the Greek translation in this passage translates as Asebon Platos, the horde of the godless ones. Apophis appears, as I have told you several times, with the epithet, the great one of the East, which is of course interesting for the geographical location of the plot, because so much of it is taking place in Asia, so in the East from an Egyptian perspective. And now it's interesting if we look at the long durée, and this is again something that I owe the information to Kim Newholt, in the demotic fragments of the exploits of the Prince Inaros, which themselves are set in the 7th century during the time of the Assyrian conquest, the great one of the East, Apopis, also appears as a very important figure. And this is interesting. So the gods made war against the giants, and millennia later on, Inaros is still fighting the giants. As I told you already, Isis interacts rather closely with the giants, especially in Papyrus Carlsberg 621. Unfortunately, the context is not that well preserved. This makes an analysis in detail difficult. Sorry, this has to come later only. The interesting point is that there are deliveries mentioned in both directions, which could be an indication of either respects or even submission. And yes, it goes in both directions. In the first place, they are filled to the Giants magazine. In the second place, they are constructed with a possessive article with a masculine suffix, so it has to be deliveries of the giant, not of Isis. This is, of course, very uncertain. One option which I would at least consider is that Isis had pretended to side with the giant in order to dupe him. And now I come to this fragment, which offers some opportunities as well as considerable problems. It's a relatively small fragment, and the interesting point is now I'm showing you only one side, but it has demotic writing on both sides, literary texts on both sides, which is not that frequent. And if we go from the hand of both sides, there is only one manuscript to which it can fit. And this is Papyrus Teptunis Tate 14, with additional fragments I published from the Florence collection. And Papyrus Teptunis 14, for those of you who don't have it in their memory, is a very interesting text because it invokes all people that they should give praise to Isis. So a tradition about Isis and the giants in the same manuscript as one calling for veneration of Isis. This sounds quite interesting. So in this passage here, we have Osiris as well as Apopis on this text, and it speaks of an army camp. So this fits well with situating it also in the complex of the war of the gods against the giants. And then there is also a female figure. Unfortunately, the name is not preserved, but there is a sentence preserved here. She lay down to feast with him, with a relatively rare verb, to lay down, which gives the impression to me that this is a Greek-style table manners, because the Greeks are lying down, whereas the Egyptians sit for eating. So lots of possibilities and lots of rather uncertain details. Now let's compare it with the Egyptian sources. We have, of course, Diodorus reporting in his account of Osiris and Isis that, according to the Egyptians, there were many-bodied beings in the time of Isis who were called giants in Greek, and they had been destroyed in the wars against Zeus and Osiris. Probably relevant in this context is also the magical papyrus PGM 57, line 8 to 9, where the magician promises to a deity addressed, presumably Isis, that he will protect her from the giants. And in this text also Ammon, the Greek form of Amun, and the limbs of Osiris are mentioned. So again, we have this large context of campaigns of probably Zeus, Amun, and Osiris against the giants. We have also, of course, this classical authors telling about Seth and his entourage and calling them giants, most especially a tradition reported in Hyginus Astronomia that Typhon attacked as a giant and the gods turned into animals and fled from him. This is similarly reported also in Ovid Metamorphosis. And from something like this depends probably the first mythographer of the Vatican. We have this also in Lucian in De Saltatione and De Sacrificio, and according to him, this happened over 10,000 years ago. Plutarch in De Isidore chapter 72 also mentions that the gods turned into animals out of fear of Typhon, even though Plutarch rejects a literal interpretation of this statement. Then it might be appropriate to bring in Nonnos of Pinopolis Dionysiaca. In his first canto, he also has a tradition of the gods flying to Egypt. In his case, he tells that all of them transformed into birds, and after the victory, he discards the shape and returned. Anyway, we have so quite a bit in Egyptian texts now about a confrontation with the giants. Then, of course, we should not forget that the Egyptian god Osiris is very often equated with the Greek god Dionysos. I give you here some of the more important attestations. I know this is very well known to all of you. And now for Osiris, we have the idea of a great campaign which leads him victoriously to India. And the most extensive version of it we have is the great epic Dionysiaca of Nonnos of Panopolis. And well, Panopolis is, of course, in Egypt. And in the last canto, the 48th, there is also a battle of Dionysos against the giants mentioned. So it should be seriously considered that all this harkens back to common traditions. Of course, if we talk all the time about wars against India, we can't forgo the fact that there was a real historic experience of the campaign of Alexander the Great, which led till India. Now I had promised you that I will tell you more about Ariane, a very interesting figure, and so that those of you who know to read Demotic can see it more clearly. Here we have the name quite well preserved, Arene, written in this manuscript and with the foreign country determinative. And this Arene is called the Great One of the Millions, and he has some place which is called his home. The name of the place is not absolutely certain. Most likely it's to be read as Selous, which I frankly said don't know how to identify. Proposals are welcome, of course. This also has the determinative of the foreign country. And from the passage in Papyrus Carlsberg 17:9, we know that he resides in a country called Bechten. And we see that Ariane is on the side of Osiris because in his reaction to the news of the latter's death, he is horrified, discards all signs of festivity and luxury, tears his robe and puts on a mourning garment. Now, if we look at the name Ariane, this was known previously from about mainly two more Egyptian sources. One is an invocation in the Demotic magical papyrus of London and Leiden, which says, Ariane, who is great, Ariane, this bringer of salvation, Ariane, who is outside. The mythological context is not that evident, but if we hear the epithet, who is outside, that would, of course, fit well with a foreign Egyptian, make him somebody who is not an Egyptian, but bringing salvation to Egyptian gods. Second piece of evidence is the funerary papyrus Harkness, published about 17 years ago by Mark Smith. And there we have a passage, you are praised forever, Osiris of Ariane, beneficent companion of Osiris. You are blessed, O blessed one of the Wagi festival. So Ariane as the beneficent companion of Osiris. It's a bit tricky in this passage if Ariane is an epithet of Osiris or a figure distinct from him. I think that in this case, the Osiris before Ariane is not the god Osiris, but the epithet of a dead person. This fits much better with the next sentence where he is a companion of Osiris and not Osiris himself. So we have this Ariane as a non-Egyptian man, a person of authority who has his base in Asia, who is on the side of Osiris, worried about his fate because of unusual phenomena in the nature. He has specialists searching for him for signs, and they look at the stars of Osiris. They are Assyrians, so well we know, of course, that astrology was very popular in Mesopotamia. This fits somehow quite well. And now one more point, which I hope will appeal to Carrie Martin, whom I saw among the listeners earlier on the list, because this Ariane or Aryan appears also about 3 times as a personal name in Demotic documents of the Ptolemaic period, mainly documents dated to about 200 BCE and situated in a purely Egyptian context given the name of his father and the general situation. So I'm asking myself whether the parents of this Aryan were Egyptians who were so impressed with this figure on the side of Osiris that they decided to name their son after him. Then in the texts I presented, we have also at least once a prince of Persia, about whom unfortunately not that much is known. And well, then I told you already that a lot of this is taking place in Asia, where Syria, called in the Demotic Egyptian text Khel, is mentioned several times. And then we have also a mention of Kabul. And this land Bechten, where Aryan is staying, to Egyptologists, it was known for a long time only through the Bentrish stela. This is a stela telling that the Egyptian king brought war until Naharina, so Mesopotamia. It tries to present this king as something of a mixture between Thutmose IV and Ramses II, but is likely to be somewhat apocryphal. So anyway, in this text, we have a country, Bechten, far away from Egypt. It takes a journey of several months to get there. And there has been some sort of speculation where this Bechten of the Bentrish stela goes back to a corruption of original new kingdom, Khati, the Hittite kingdom. But anyway, by now we have a growing Egyptian documentation of attestations of this land Bechten, especially in the context of the Inaros epic. Now, what I would like to read as the Prince of Kabul. The name is written Kabru in the text, but of course R and L are not distinct in the Fayum area. Then another interesting detail is this is a small fragment, but you can read quite clearly the land of the women, which is a designation which in Egyptian texts we otherwise know from the Demotic Egyptian Amazon narrative, where we also see this land of the women lies somewhere in Syria in the broader sense and adjacent to India. Now about this land of the women, or let's say Amazons, there are 2 pointers in very opposing directions. On the one hand, we have Diodorus 355, who tells that Myrina, the Amazon queen of Libya, has concluded a treaty of friendship with Horus, son of Isis and king of Egypt. We might discuss if this is of any relevance. We might discuss if this is of any relevance also. Libya is of course not in Asia. And on the other hand, there are some Asiatic traditions, especially in Chinese sources, starting in the Han period, of a land of the women lying somewhere in the southeast of Tibet near India. Also quite an interesting detail to consider. So we see a lot remains to be clarified further, but Asia as a general location is quite obvious. We have Persia, Bactria, and we come near to India, at least India as it was conceived in antiquity, where Pakistan was also included under it. And of course, this long geographical horizon would, I think, hardly be possible before the campaign of Alexander the Great. Now, about Aryan, coming back to him, there's a very important item of evidence, and this was really, for me, a mesmerizing effect, because I think only a few months after I had brought out my edition of this Demotic Egyptian tale about Isis and Aryan, I was contacted by Peter Parsons because he had identified remnants of a Greek narrative about Isis and a certain Aryanes. This has now been published as Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 5481 with remains of 2 columns. Part of the text is quite close to what we know already from Plutarch de Iside, especially in the Byblos episode. There are some differences and some interesting new elements. First point is the parents of Isis are given in the Egyptian name forms as Neit and Kebk. There is also a rather enigmatic figure called Osef in the Greek text. I would propose that Osef is a phonetic rendering of the Egyptian god, which Egyptologists normally call Harsaphes, but from documentary papyri, we know that his name was more likely to be pronounced as Asef or Esef. This Arianes in the Greek text is explicitly indicated as a friend of Osiris and an enemy of the Titans. So the preserved episode shows Isis in Byblos after the death of Osiris, and the Arianes of this romance is clearly identical to the Ariane I discovered in the Demotic fragment. In this case, I would claim that the Demotic Egyptian material is primary, given the phonetic form of the name, because the Greek Romance shows the name with a final S, which brings him into the Greek inflection of nouns. By contrast, the Demotic Egyptian form does not show any such ending and is thus unlikely to have been taken over from a Greek source. But of course, this Greek Romance might be an important intermediary stepping stone towards what we finally have preserved in Plutarch. So let's resume what we have so far. We have in Egypt this tradition of Osiris as a living king over Egypt. This has existed already for some time previously to the Hellenistic period. We have Seth and Apopis since ancient times very well known as enemies of the gods, especially the sun god and Osiris. We have the connection between Osiris and Dionysos, which goes back at least to Herodotus. We have the Greek tradition of the war of the gods against the giants, and we have also the victorious campaign of Dionysos to India. We also have the historical impression of Alexander's campaign to India. I think that in this context, the Egyptian myths were developed further, so to say, brought into a fitting line with the Greek traditions. And then it was that a narrative of a campaign of Osiris in Asia was created, where his opponents combine the traits of the traditional enemies of the gods with those of the Greek giants. Probably this came about shortly after the campaign of Alexander, at least if I am right to postulate that all these demotic fragments belong to somewhat the same tradition. We have the Berkeley Papyrus as a witness already from the earlier 3rd century BCE. So I suppose that this mixture of tradition came about first in Egyptian language under Greek influence, and then itself was transformed into a Greek language romance. And this Greek text might have been available to Diodorus or his source. Diodorus presents it quite abbreviated, but in principle with the most important plots all present in chapters 11 to 27 of his first book, where he speaks at length about Osiris and his heroic deeds. And then, of course, we have Plutarch de Isabel, who is likely to be also dependent to some degree on these traditions. We have to keep in mind Plutarch focuses a lot more specifically on the events surrounding the death of Osiris, hints at all the other traditions only very briefly. Sometimes you really need to know this tradition of the war of the gods against the giants under the leadership of Osiris in order to understand the very brief passages given by Plutarch. Now, finally, I will pursue 2 forms. On the one, 2 further points. This is sort of a final outlook to my presentation. On the one hand, in the Roman imperial period, we have a very observable change of image in the iconographic type of a lot of Egyptian deities, insofar as some of them, especially Horus and Anubis, appear armed in cuirass, just more or less like Roman military persons. And if we see them so obviously clad for war, we can ask ourselves if this type of depiction is connected with the Egyptian tradition of the war of the gods. And on the other hand, now I have something which brings me to Veronique Dason's presentation, the previous one in this lecture series. I was unfortunately not possible to attend it in person, but I could at least watch it on the website. And since she brought up this Chnubis gem, I think I can take it up shortly. This Chnubis is a lion-headed serpent on magical gems from the Roman imperial period, especially the 2nd and 3rd century CE.
Out there now.
And Chnubis has a name derived from the Egyptian stellar deacon Kenmet. And the iconography of the lion-headed serpent in Egypt as such goes back at least to the New Kingdom. And on these gems, you have some Greek epithets frequently occurring, and among them is Gigantorecta, so the giant conqueror, sometimes also Gigantopantorecta, giant all-conqueror, and rarely also something like giant intertwiner. And there is a second frequent element, Barophyta, snake crusher. Of course, relevant if you remember that these Egyptian giants, the apophyses, are snakes. And in order to bring this together with also the previous image about Horus, one final step about the Egyptian deacon Kenmet, because in Egyptian traditions, the deacons are stellar figures who have tutelary deities. And where the deacon family, deacons in Egyptians, there are several different traditions, and the most important one in the late period is the so-called Tanis family. And in this Tanis family, the deacon associated with Kenmet is Haroeris, the warlike figure of the elder Horus. Well, I could at least see that Horus does play a role in the demotic fragments of the war of the gods against the giants, even though we don't have that much preserved. But let's say this intriguing possible link between Horus and the giant crushing Chnubis is quite interesting, gives at least some glimpses. Well, ultimately, I would say that more or less everything I have presented today is more about glimpses and possibilities than about certainties. So thank you very much about this. Well, this is just one final images where we have a very bad idea of what Apopis was. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk about this little known text, and I'm sure there will be many questions. So if you feel ready and you have any, I'm asking the audience to either raise your hands or just put your questions in the chat. In the meanwhile, I will put the links that I promised also in the chat. Yes, so we have the first question from Rana Brentjes. Could Selous be a personal name rather than a place name?
No, definitely a place name. You can tell it not only from the determinative, it's the geographical determinative, but also from the fact that it's immediately afterwards called his home.
Mm-hmm.
I think we had an earlier question as well
sorry.
from
Yeah.
Ivona Frinkamheim. She says, thank you so much. If this Demotic narrative originates in the Hellenistic period, is it possible that Arian's homeland is in Ivona, do you want to ask whether his homeland is in Seleucia?
Yes, that's correct. Sorry, one of the sorry
That's
for the
fine.
typo there.
Yeah, actually, Seleucia was proposed to be once before, but I think that phonetically it does not really work, especially if you consider that you have to use the Greek pronunciation, Seleucia, not the English one.
Thank you.
Yes, I think we have a question from HR Dokov. Please go ahead.
Yes, I had a question on, again, on this place name. Is this Selus mentioned in any of the text, or is this the only occurrence we have of it?
Well, to my knowledge, it's the only occurrence.
So, yeah, okay. So there is no other way to know what it can be.
No, it's quite obviously a foreign place, and somehow I think the best option is if some specialist for Asiatic geography finds a good phonetic fit. I think Peter Parsons proposed that this Arianis, that the name has to be located somewhere in Persia because of this Persian conception of the Aryans, which would make sense, but I'm really not a specialist about ancient Persian geography. Maybe somebody will find the solution there.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Dominic. What is the date range for this text? Can you please repeat?
Okay, if you accept that all these fragments I showed to you belong to one bigger story, then we have a date range from the earlier 3rd century BCE, that's the Berkeley fragment as the earliest one, until about the first half of the 2nd century CE for the main bulk of the Teptunis fragments. That's as far as the tradition itself is concerned. If you include the mention of Arian in the Demotic Magical Papyrus of London and Louvre, we would probably go even a little bit more recent, because that manuscript dates to about the turn from the 2nd to 3rd century CE.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is from Lada Chaba. Why do you think the Egyptians were so receptive to Greek myth and historical events so early in the Hellenistic period? Goes the question.
Well, it's a very interesting question, probably an overarching question for this whole lecture series, I think. And well, it might be simply because they don't want to stay behind. They want to interact with the dominating discourse. That's at least what I can imagine. I think we would probably have to enlarge the question further and think, for example, about possible Egyptian backgrounds for parts of the Alexander romance, like this idea of Nectanebus as the last indigenous king of Egypt who sired Alexander the Great, which is, of course, quite a point about bringing together Egyptian ideas with Greek figures.
Is there maybe a chance that the Ptolemaic rulers played an active part in propagating these stories in view of their campaigns to Syria at the time? Or is that something we should keep apart?
It is at least entirely possible, because let's say this is linked to something about which I decided not to speak really today, about the tradition of the body parts of Osiris. I mean, we know as Egyptologists that there was an idea that the body parts of Osiris were scattered all over the land. Every city had, so to say, a small snippet of him. and bringing together the body parts was an eminently political act. And we have an expansion of this conception beyond Egypt. There is, for example, an inscription from Thessaloniki, which tells about the Larnax coming to land there. And then we have Byblos as a place of Osiris' body in Plutarch. And there are some Demotic Egyptian traditions, especially linked with the Inaros epic, which tell about the body parts of Osiris in Assyria. And of course, bringing back the body parts of Osiris is a royal task, and the early Ptolemaic rulers often spoke about bringing back the images of the gods from Syria. So it would make sense to link this into sort of a political message, which was certainly in the interest of the Ptolemaic rulers.
Okay, thank you. I think we have one more question from Rana Brentjes. Are there any depiction of the Osiris giants battle in temples in Egypt? And are they connected with constellations?
Unfortunately not. In Egyptian temples, we sometimes have this traditional iconography of Apopis being hit with a spear. There's one famous depiction in the temple of Hebes in Kharga, Oasis. And I think there's also one more temple in the Oasis where this is depicted. But this is, so to say, rather traditional. Apopis is just a snake. Unfortunately, in the Egyptian temples, we don't have anything linking up with the Greek image tradition of the giants as humans with the legs in form of a snake.
Okay, yes, we have one more. I'm sorry, it's just kind of difficult to maneuver between the messages. So from Brian, thank you for the great presentation. I wonder what you think of PGM 102 in light of this research. The specific line I'm thinking of is, "You whom the 16 giants flank as bodyguard." I'm not going to read out the Greek, but you have it in the chat.
Yeah, the problem is at the moment I can't see the chat.
You can.
I could, but then I have to close my presentation window, which I could do, of course. Okay, so I will do it so then I can
Okay.
look.
Shall I read it again? The specific line? Oh.
I think that now I'm at a point where I can more or less see it. One moment. Okay, now I have the chat before. Quite an interesting passage. I will have to think about it further. At the moment, let's say the tricky question would be, who would have the giants on his side? So from this passage, could it be some anti-hero, so to speak? I mean, we know in this magical traditions that sometimes the magicians are invoking Seth, so they could place themselves on the side of the enemies of the gods also.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Any more questions, comments, or if I'm missing something, please feel free to let me know.
Could I just ask?
Yes.
I didn't quite catch. You said there was an Egyptian formula. Was it a sort of curse formula where you said, "May the enemy of someone good suffer"?
It's not a cursed formula. It's a sort of euphemistic way of expression, where if something really bad happens to a very positively connotated figure, like a god or the king of Egypt, you say that this evil happened to the enemy of this figure. This is an expression which took Egyptologists some time to unravel. The pioneering work was done by Georges Poussinel, and I put up a number of Demotic Egyptian attestations as well.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Any more questions or comments? Because if not, 1, 2, 3, no. Then I think I would like to thank again Professor Quack for this wonderful presentation, and we will be putting this video as well on the Palladium website. Feel free to watch this and the others again, and we are hoping to see you next time as well in about a month's time in the next lecture. So I think this is it for today. And thank you all for coming and joining. And thank you for this wonderful lecture.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you on my part. Goodbye and have a nice evening.
And you too. Thank you very much.
Or whatever time it is.